Biologically, boundaries live in the nervous system. If your nervous system doesn't have clear boundaries, meaning it's constantly responding to demands, stressors, or expectations without pause, it stays in a state of threat, that high alert. That keeps stress hormones like cortisol elevated. It disrupts sleep, digestion, immune function, and even hormone balance. Healthy boundaries are a signal to the body that it can downshift. They help regulate the autonomic nervous system, allows us to move out of that chronic fight or flight and into rest and repair, rest and healing.
Welcome to Medicine with Meaning. Today's episode is about something many of us struggle with, but rarely connect to our health: boundaries. Not boundaries as a personality trait or a communication skill, but boundaries as a biological necessity. When we overextend, overgive, or stay constantly available, the body pays a price, often quietly and over time. Dr. Julie, let's explore how boundaries protect the nervous system, support healing, and are essential for long-term well-being. Dr. Julie, when people hear the word boundaries, they often think of relationships or communication. From a medical perspective, how are boundaries actually connected to biology?
So when we talk about boundaries from a medical perspective, we're really talking about how the body knows what's safe and what feels like too much. Biologically, boundaries live in the nervous system. If your nervous system doesn't have clear boundaries, meaning it's constantly responding to demands, stressors, or expectations without pause, it stays in a state of threat, that, high alert. And that keeps stress hormones like cortisol elevated. It disrupts sleep, digestion, immune function, and even hormone balance. So healthy boundaries are a signal to the body that it can downshift. They help regulate the autonomic nervous system, allows us to move out of that chronic fight or flight and into rest and repair, rest and healing. So when someone says they struggle with boundaries, it's not a character flaw. I hear a body that's been trained, and often for years, to override its own signals. And from a biological perspective, boundary work is about restoring that internal feedback loop. It's noticing the cues of overwhelm or depletion or resentment. That's often a signal of, poor boundaries. And to notice these signals early and respond to them before the system tips into burnout or even illness. So in that sense, boundaries aren't just interpersonal, they're physiological. They're, in fact, one of the most powerful forms of preventive medicine we have.
Yeah, I like how you mentioned resentment. It came to me that could be a really clear sign that boundaries are not being established. When you feel resentment afterwards, it's like you weren't really taking care of yourself in a way. And what happens in the nervous system and stress response when boundaries are consistently crossed or ignored?
Yeah, so when boundaries are consistently crossed or ignored, the nervous system adapts as if it's living in an unsafe or unpredictable environment, and our stress response stays activated. And, there's ongoing cortisol and adrenaline, and your nervous system can have a huge response even to small everyday demands. So over time, our nervous system loses flexibility and our brains become threat focused, and our body is living in this constant fight or flight. Our hormones, our stress hormones, are more easily triggered, and very often it can take longer to return to that rest and digest, that, baseline of regulation. And clinically, this shows up as poor sleep, inflammation, digestive symptoms, anxiety, irritability, and it can even cause fatigue. So what's important to know is that the body isn't broken. It's just adapting. And when boundaries aren't respected, or I like to say honored, the nervous system learns it has to stay on guard to function. And restoring boundaries helps retrain the stress response. It allows the nervous system to move out of that chronic defense or survival mode and moves it back into regulation. And that is so necessary for repair and healing and building resilience in our body.
And I'm sure you can stay like that for years without really even realizing it. No, like it can become almost your permanent state. Like you get used to living on guard, like you mentioned. And why do you think so many people, especially women and caregivers, do live in this way?
Yeah, I do see this all the time, especially with women and caregivers. This is an issue for me personally as a doctor mom. I think there's a multitude of reasons. I think the first is that I think as women, our nervous systems are almost always oriented outward, right? Um, who needs me? What problems need solving? What am I forgetting? I think, we're just sort of trained to do this as mothers, caring for young children. And this caregiving does require a lot of vigilance. And so over time, the body gets used to living in that state. And another reason, or another layer perhaps, is the social messages that so many women grow up with. That is, be helpful, be nice, be available, don't rock the boat. And so I think, women, our nervous system just sort of stays on alert. One, it's biologically wired to, as mothers, right, to care for young children, and the social messages that we get. And so that's why, boundaries can feel so hard. It's not that we don't understand them, but it's that on a body level, setting boundaries can feel risky. It's because we've learned that connection or safety comes from showing up, overgiving, or being needed. So then saying no can trigger guilt or anxiety, even when it's the right thing to do. So I don't see this as a flaw. It's just a pattern that our bodies have learned. And boundary work is really about teaching the nervous system that it is okay to pause. It is okay to have limits, and to trust that connection doesn't disappear when you pause to take care of yourself.
This resonates so much because I'm not a mother, and I was going to ask if it's like a biological thing also, if there's a biological I want to say feature, but I don't know if that's like the correct term, but like a biological characteristic that also influences us to be that way, women, or it's just how we're trained. Because I feel like, for example, in my own life, I always feel responsible, and I didn't even know this until a little while ago, that I just feel responsible for everybody's well-being, always, like my siblings. and it's always there. Even if I'm not focusing on it, it's just like a little whisper. And yeah, I just wonder if there's biology that determines that as well.
I think for sure, um, whether you're a mother or not, it is in our biology. I think it makes sense that, as having the potential for offspring, whether you choose to have them or not, it makes sense that our biology is wired so that we care for our offspring. So I think that is a part of our biology. But it's not always just nature. There's nurture, right? Sort of how we were raised by our own families, our parents. Our birth order probably matters in that. Um, Certainly, our personalities, I think all of those are, factors that create our ability to set boundaries. There are certain people that are better at it. I did hear somewhere that might be estrogen too. That's sort of what connects all women, and that, that may be what makes us, more natural caregivers. And when women hit menopause, and their estrogen declines, it's not that they care less, but, they're able to focus more on themselves. And that's why, it could be a very empowering period for women in menopause. So I don't think there's one factor. I think it's multiple factors. But it does make sense that, nature created in women the ability to care for offspring, right? That makes sense.
And yeah, you mentioned something earlier about being needed. For many of us, subconsciously, yeah, it's tied to our self-worth. I do this for others, therefore I'm needed. My presence is it's valued. So if I don't do that, then my identity is not what it should be, or my worth is not uh
Yeah.
where I want it to be, if it makes sense.
Well, that is just, an important life evolution, right? That we, we are worthy inherently, that we are whole, and our worthiness is inherent, and it's not externally determined. Takes a long, well, it's still something I'm learning, but that's sort of a lifelong lesson. I think as teenagers, we're so worried about what everybody else thinks, and our worth comes from, what our friends think of us. And then, we evolve, and, not, not everybody evolves, but that's, what I hope for myself is that, my self-worth, my self-love is just inherent. It is part of my being. That's what I'm trying to learn. And, yeah, that's a work in progress. And so, I think especially as women, we are, sort of the messaging is that, again, that, you want to be caring, be loving, be nurturing. And those are the messages that we get. And, perhaps some of us were conditioned to, feel worthy when we do those things. But I guess I'm trying to learn to separate it. We are worthy because we are. I don't know if that resonates.
Absolutely. And just to kind of to go into a different question, but I wanted to mention something before, like it might be controversial. Um, but I've seen how, there's this huge pressure on how you look. And, if your hair is like this, or all these things that we hear socially about how women must be all the time in our physique. And that's one aspect that can show our worth or validate us, or being nurturing or caregiving. Like there's two different pressures. I feel like two different paths that women have as a choice to show their worth.
Yeah, so sort of different female archetypes, I think is what you're referring to. And, Yeah, I would say, but bust those archetypes and find that authenticity in ourselves and have the freedom to express our true self and to tap into our inner knowing, our inner wisdom versus focusing on that external validation, that external measuring stick, because it's hard to measure up to. And um, when you're connected to your inner knowing, and I'll call it self-love or just love in general, you come from just a more authentic place versus that external measuring tape. And it probably feels better too.
Yeah, it feels like something that you can actually be and not something that it's always moving and never achievable. And it's almost like a ghost that you're chasing or something.
Yeah, for sure.
And Dr. Julie, was there a time in your own life when lack of boundaries showed up physically through fatigue, tension, irritability, or illness?
Yes, absolutely. And, honestly, I probably didn't even realize it at the time. I just thought that constant tension and irritability were part of being responsible and capable and productive and high performing. Um, luckily, I've developed more awareness and evolution, though, to be honest, boundaries are still something that I struggle with. In fact, I jokingly say that I didn't realize I could say no until I was around the age of 50. And before that, it was something, that it wasn't something that I questioned. I just said yes to everything, to work, to people, to pushing through. And certainly my body felt it. And, yeah, it's more recently that I've recognized that it's important to practice boundaries. And, it's certainly, something that I still work at. And, I think it's important to understand what the limits of your body are. Going back to, how boundaries are rooted in the nervous system, you have to understand, what your nervous system can handle and that we need to allow it to recover and to have an opportunity to be regulated. And so, when we have that nervous system overload or when our boundaries aren't respected, our bodies will respond and speak to us through our symptoms. And for me, it definitely showed up as tight shoulders. I think I've shared on prior episodes how I had the frozen shoulder. And I think what was most disturbing for me as a signal of not honoring my boundaries is my short fuse and my irritability and that feeling of resentment. That is not a good place to live from. Certainly, I didn't want to express that with my loved ones. So when I noticed and became aware, that's when I recognized, okay, something's got to change here. And I started paying attention to my body and the signals and the symptoms and what I needed to do to regulate my nervous system. But I think the first step is just listening to our bodies and being aware. And that is the first step to any meaningful change.
I still resonate a lot with the short fuse and the resentment. Thank you for pointing that out because I think that it really is a good cue to teach us whether we're respecting our boundaries or not. If we're feeling resentment, if we have short fuse, then perhaps it's a good cue to look at how we are setting boundaries or if there's any work that we can do in that sense. And how did learning to set clear boundaries change not just your schedule, but how your body felt day to day?
Certainly, I was surprised to learn that yeah, I can feel good in my body and in my mind. Physically, I felt less tension, less tightness in my neck and my shoulders, and my energy felt steadier instead of that, wired but tired feeling. And thankfully, I was less reactive, less irritable. Um, but mentally, something shifted as well. And this is also very important. I started to feel more aligned. Um, when I started honoring my limits, there was less internal friction, maybe less of that self-betrayal we spoke about earlier, less of that quiet, resentment that can come from, saying yes when you mean no. So yeah, I just felt calmer in my mind as well. And it just felt clearer. And I felt more in integrity. And that was very grounding in and of itself. And so when your actions match what your body and your values are telling you, the nervous system just automatically relaxes. It's almost like you stop arguing with yourself all day long. And so for me, this shift allowed me to feel different in my body and mind, and boundaries didn't feel restrictive. They felt like regulating. They created more space, and my body just felt more settled, and my mind felt more spacious and more at ease. Felt so much better.
And Dr. Julie, for those who feel guilt in setting boundaries or who have that, associated to boundary setting, that feeling, what would you say? Or how can they deal with that?
Yeah, well, I think it's really normal for us to feel guilty. Um, Especially, we talked about women and caregivers, and the guilt shows up not because the boundary is wrong, but because setting boundaries is probably new for many of us, right? And it's not, being selfish or pushing people away. It's really about protecting our nervous system. When the body is constantly overextended, it really can't regulate or heal. And limits are what make it possible to show up with more steadiness and presence. And so I think people need to change the story or, flip how they see, boundary setting. And, I also explained that guilt is sometimes a body response. If someone has learned that safety comes from giving, or being needed and constantly, giving to others, then when you stop to take care of yourself, you can feel uncomfortable at first. And, don't think that setting a boundary is a mistake. It just means that the nervous system is recalibrating. And over time, as the body settles, that guilt will fade. And what will come is more clarity and energy and self-trust. So, I would say that this is a process and it is normal to feel guilty at first, but, it really is about protecting our nervous system and therefore our health, right? We've talked a lot about how our nervous system dysregulation leads to so many symptoms and dysfunction in our body.
It never ceases to amaze me how much of the mind is connected to our physical well-being. And that's what makes it a bit more complex, because I think that the mind repeats patterns that's been trained on for so long, maybe our entire life. So recognizing the patterns is like already a little bit hard, and then changing those patterns, it's creating new habits, right? It's how the intention that we create those new habits with also has an impact.
For sure. And so I, we know that our thoughts alone can trigger stress response. And sometimes, all that overthinking and just being in our head can be troublesome for our health and our well-being. And so it's, recognizing those thoughts, especially, the scary thoughts that may not be true, are probably not true, and recognizing that they aren't true and letting go of those thoughts. And I think, that comes back to mindfulness practice. It teaches us to, be, in the present moment and be present without judgment. And I think, that's the harder part, without the judgment. And I'll speak for myself. It's my critical mind, that often is the most triggering of stress in my body. And that in of itself can cause harm, regardless of all the external stuff, external pressures we've been talking about. So it really is, it is all of the above. And, to, recognize that our mind and our thoughts influence our physiology.
And Dr. Julie, in your practice, what symptoms most commonly signal boundary overload, even when patients don't describe it that way?
Yeah. I would say, most people don't come in talking about their boundaries, right? Or that people don't like to be aware that we all have limits. And so nobody likes to start the conversation there. So they come in talking about their symptoms. And so, when I, see boundary overload, it really is synonymous with nervous system overload. And it goes back to all of those symptoms that are triggered by, chronic fight or flight, chronic, stress response. And so it can be, muscle tension, especially in the neck and shoulders, headaches, sleep issues, certainly, anxiety, feeling easily overwhelmed, that irritability, and then digestive symptoms. I think most people recognize that, our nervous system is intimately connected with our digestive system, and that, nervous system overload can cause digestive symptoms, especially when there's ongoing stress. And so, what ties this all together is that when we don't have, clear boundaries, or when we're overwhelmed, our nervous system does not have space to downshift. And the body is constantly responding to stressors. And so, these symptoms are due to that. And it's not because the body is failing. It is just communicating that it needs more safety and more recovery. So again, it's about listening to these physical symptoms as messengers.
Dr. Julie, my sister, she's young, but last year or a couple years ago, she went through a depression. And later on, when she got out of it, she realized that a lot of it was people pleasing. And that was really interesting for her to like outgrow certain, I guess, personal behaviors. But my question is, can you explain how chronic overgiving, people pleasing, or constant availability keeps the body in stress state and contributes to burnout, inflammation, or hormone imbalance.
I'm so glad your sister became aware so that she can heal. And we don't think about people pleasing as something that can be harmful. But when you're just pleasing others, you may not be aligning with your own needs. And that can become problematic when you're constantly overgiving and always available. You're not paying attention to what your nervous system needs. And, you're almost always like on alert, trying to sense what someone else needs. And that can, keep our nervous system on high alert, right? And it can keep our stress hormones elevated. And even if nothing dramatic is happening, and over time, that constant stress and high alert can impact, our bodily functions like our immune system, our digestive system, our ability to sleep and restore from sleep. And so when our body is in that constant survival mode, it causes inflammation instead of repair. It can cause hormonal imbalance. And this is, what leads to burnout. And so that awareness piece is really key. And yeah, I'm so glad you brought up the people pleasing. I think so many of us have that. I think that's biologically wired, right? It goes back to our ancestral times when you didn't want to be booted out of the village, right? Because that would mean that you would not survive on your own. And so, yeah, I think many of us, have that people pleasing in us. It's something to be aware of. I think it's important that we are kind and loving to other people. It's not it's not an or, right? But you don't want to do it in a way that betrays yourself and puts your nervous system on high alert. Needs to be aligned. And I think that, when we are not in alignment, that is what causes illness and certainly depression in your sister's case. So it really is about just, honoring ourselves and honoring the regulation of our nervous system. I know I talk a lot about the nervous system, but I think, that is the root of so many symptoms and dysfunction. And when the nervous system is balanced, our bodies have a chance to do its thing that it knows to do. The natural intelligence of our body is allowed to function properly. And that's where we feel good. We have less symptoms. So restoring boundaries, helps the nervous system settle, which is often the first step towards feeling better again.
And it's so interesting how, like you mentioned, we're wired to people please because we obviously, it's a sense of belonging. We want to be a part of a community for our survival. So that's almost intrinsic. But then it's interesting how so many people that have that need as a priority end up feeling more lonely.
Yeah, or it's exhausting sometimes, right? If your energy is always outward and not paying attention to what's going on inside of you, that can be exhausting. And you're not honoring first your connection with yourself. And when we are attuned to ourself and really honor our inner knowing, our inner self, then I think everything else automatically aligns and we're able to connect with people. And I think I said earlier that, um, having boundaries to protect our nervous system doesn't mean we don't connect with people, and it doesn't mean we put up a wall. So it doesn't have to be such extremes. And boundary setting can be, something that's quiet and not dramatic. Could be as simple as going to bed earlier because, that allows you to get more sleep. That's an example of, setting a boundary for ourselves. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're not available for other people. It doesn't necessarily have to live in these, big expressions of boundary. It could be small and quiet.
And one thing that also stuck to me is that you mentioned that when your nervous system is regulated, then your body can just do what it knows to do. So I think what you meant is your body knows how to heal. We wouldn't need to have external aid to heal if our nervous systems were balanced, because then our body would do that as a part of their nature, no? Like,
Absolutely. Yeah. But that's the big question is, how to regulate our nervous system. Today we're talking about boundaries as one way. Of course, there are, many exercises to stimulate the relaxation response. We've talked about meditation in another episode. Certainly breath work and yoga are similar. And so there's many paths to, regulating our nervous system. But I'm so glad we're talking about boundaries today because, that's another important way to regulate our nervous system, by sort of honoring, what we let in.
and Dr. Julie, for someone listening who feels overwhelmed but doesn't know where to draw the line, what's one small boundary they could experiment with this week?
So I usually suggest starting with time, not people, because it's a little bit easier. So pick one small protected pocket in your day, even 10 minutes, and decide ahead of time that nothing else gets scheduled there. No emails, no requests, no multitasking. So it might be a quiet cup of tea or a short walk or just sitting without external input. And what matters isn't what you do, it's that your body gets the message that you are allowed to pause. And that consistent boundary can begin to calm the nervous system and build self-trust. And once that feels doable, then everything else becomes easier to see. So, it really is, take a moment for yourself, even 10 minutes.
And if there's one reframe you'd offer listeners about boundary and health, what would it be?
I'd reframe boundaries as a health practice, not as a personality trait. They're not about being rigid or difficult. They're about giving your nervous system the conditions it needs to function well. When boundaries are missing, the body stays in stress. When boundaries are present, the body can regulate, repair, and heal. So if you're working with your health and you're feeling stuck, it's worth asking not just what you're doing, but how much you're holding. Sometimes the most healing thing you can do isn't adding another habit, but creating more space for yourself.
That's a difficult one for
Well,
people.
it takes
Well, for me, yeah.
Yeah, for all of us. And I think I shared earlier that it's still a work in progress for me. This is probably my hardest health practice, I would say. And so, that's why we call it practice.
I read the other day that a healthy, what was it? Like a healthy or regulated nervous system doesn't need more push. doesn't need more good habits. It needs permission or something of the sorts. And it reminded me when you said oftentimes we want to feel healthier and we add something onto the list, but that pause of not responding to anything, doesn't matter what you're doing, but telling your body that you're okay to be in that space, to pause. It does a lot more than what we are programmed to think that it would. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we always think, oh, doing more is good, it's productive. But I always say doing more is not always more. Sometimes, doing less can be more. And, it depends on the person and what's going on. And it's really important to personalize. And, we all have different seasons, right now for me, winter is about being, a little bit more disciplined and productive. There have been other seasons where I was just like, I need to just, be at ease. And so, just listen to your body. I think that's been an ongoing, consistent message of mine is our bodies will tell us what we need.
Thank you so much, Dr. Julie. You've left me with a lot to reflect on and the message to allow myself to be more at ease.
Well, if today's conversation brings up questions for you about stress, boundaries, and how this shows up in your own body, you're always welcome to reach out to me. You can contact me via my website at www.julietawmd.com. That's JulietawMD.com, or send me a DM on Instagram at julie.taw.md. All questions are welcome, and thank you for listening.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Medicine with Meaning. Boundaries aren't walls, they're regulation. See you next time.